raw March air of 1945, the Rhine lay gray and swollen, the last natural fortress protecting a collapsing Reich. Sergeant Harold Dahl stood amid a forest of rubber and wire, watching his crew of artists transform a muddy field near Viersen into a magnet for German steel. The deception was a masterpiece of shadow and sound, but the cost became clear when the first heavy shells screamed toward their empty positions, shredding canvas turrets instead of armor plate. As the ground heaved and the air filled with cordite, Dahl understood the Germans had bought the lie completely, training their batteries on 1,100 defenseless men. He looked at the repair kits, then at the darkening horizon, knowing the next 10 minutes would decide whether they stayed to keep the illusion alive or abandoned the ghosts to the coming barrage. I hope this story hits you as hard as it hit me while writing it. Links in the channel description. Get comfortable, hit subscribe, and let's dive in. The road to this moment began 6 days earlier. The chill of March 1945 hung heavy over the low Rhine Valley, a damp, gray shroud that seemed to seep into the very marrow of the men gathered in the shadows near Viersen. To the east, the Rhine remained the final, formidable barrier protecting the heart of a dying but desperate Germany. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and the distant, rhythmic thud of heavy artillery, a reminder that while the Third Reich was crumbling, it still possessed teeth. Among the ruins and the mud, the soldiers of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency that belied their unusual origins. They were not the hardened career infantrymen one expected to find on the tip of the spear during the final phase of the war in Europe. Instead, this was a ghost army composed of artists, architects, set designers, and engineers, men recruited from the prestigious art schools of New York and Philadelphia. With an average intelligence quotient of 119, they were perhaps the most cerebral unit in the United States Army. Among them stood men who would one day be household names, like the illustrator Arthur Singer and the designer Bill Blass, though here they were simply soldiers bound by a vow of absolute secrecy. Since their activation at Camp Forest, Tennessee in January 1944, they had conducted over 20 deception operations from the beaches of Normandy to the Siegfried Line, yet they were forbidden from sharing a single word of their theatrics with the world. The atmosphere was electric with the weight of a new, massive undertaking, Operation Viersen. As the Ninth Army prepared for its decisive thrust across the river, the Ghosts received their final orders from Lieutenant Colonel Merrick H. Truly. The scale of the mission was staggering. These 1,100 men were tasked with portraying 2 full infantry divisions, the 30th and the 79th, to convince the Wehrmacht that 40,000 Americans were massing for a crossing here rather than 10 miles to the north. It was a traveling show of the most dangerous kind, a masterpiece of illusion where the price of a poor performance was measured in blood. They checked their compressors and adjusted the markings on their equipment, veterans of a war fought with shadows and sound. As night began to fall over the valley, the soldiers prepared to step onto their largest stage yet, knowing that the success of the Rhine crossing rested not on their firepower, but on their ability to lie convincingly to the face of the enemy. By the 16th of March, 1945, the schoolhouse in Geleen, Holland, had become a frantic hive of intellectual warfare. Within those cramped walls, the soldiers of the 23rd prepared to stage a production that would have intimidated a Broadway director. The briefing delivered by Lieutenant Colonel Merrick H. Truly was chilling in its simplicity. They were to simulate the presence of the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions within the 13th Corps sector. The goal was to tether the German defenders to the banks of the Rhine at Krefeld, while the real Ninth Army secretly massed 16 miles to the north. To succeed, 1,100 men had to convincingly wear the skin of 40,000. The physical labor was grueling and surreal. In the muddy fields, teams of 4 worked the bellows and compressors, breathing life into more than 600 inflatable vehicles. Rubber tubes hissed as 93-pound shapes transformed into the hulking silhouettes of M4 Sherman tanks and L5 liaison planes. Nearby, the camouflage engineers of the 603rd Battalion pored over poop sheets, meticulously painting divisional tactical markings on bumper plates and sewing counterfeit shoulder patches onto their field jackets. Every detail had to be flawless. Even the songs the men sang in local taverns were rehearsed to match the regional dialects of the units they were impersonating. A heavy silence often fell over the men as they worked near the river's edge. They were painfully aware that they were actors without an audience, operating in the shadow of the German guns with nothing but 50 caliber machine guns for defense. Private George Dramas looked at the fragile rubber decoy beside him and whispered to a comrade about the absurdity of their position. They were a unit with no real teeth, inviting a frontal attack from a desperate Wehrmacht. They moved with a stoic professional pride, knowing that every hour they maintained this illusion bought another hour of safety for the real infantrymen training on the River Maas. As night approached on the 18th, the sonic technicians of the 31st 32nd Signal Service Company calibrated their massive 500-pound speakers. Using complex firing tables developed by Bell Labs, they accounted for the wind speed and humidity to ensure their recorded symphony of clanking treads and shouting sergeants would drift across the water with terrifying authenticity. The weather was turning cold, the damp air carrying the scent of impending rain and ozone. With their inflatable theater of war packed and ready, the men of the Ghost Army stood on the precipice of their greatest deception, the tension coiled tight in their chests like a spring. The sun dipped below the horizon on the 18th of March, 1945, and the curtain rose on a symphony of artifice. Under the bruising purple of the twilight sky, the silence of the Viersen sector was shattered not by gunfire, but by the frantic, rhythmic pumping of air. The men of the 603rd Camouflage Engineers moved like shadows, their breath hitching in the cold dampness as they wrestled with masses of limp rubber. Within minutes, the skeletal frames of M4 Sherman tanks began to swell and bloat, rising from the mud like prehistoric beasts reclaiming the earth. These were the hollow titans of the 23rd, 93-pound giants of painted canvas and rubber tubing that, from a distance of 200 yards, looked every bit the 40-ton killers they mimicked. As the darkness deepened, the air grew thick with the metallic tang of ozone and the heavy scent of diesel exhaust. The 31st 32nd Signal Service Company rolled their M3A1 half-tracks into position, the massive 500-pound speakers mounted on the rear looming like dark maws. Sergeant Victor Dowd signaled his crew, and the silence was obliterated. A cacophony of recorded violence roared into the night, the high-pitched whine of tank engines, the rhythmic clatter of bogey wheels, and the sharp, metallic echoes of hammers striking steel. These sounds, meticulously captured on wire recorders back at Fort Knox, rolled across the Rhine Valley with terrifying weight. The firing tables had been calculated perfectly. The low-frequency rumble of a phantom armored division seemed to shake the very foundations of the nearby German pillboxes. In the midst of this sonic storm, the human element of the deception took its place on the stage. Soldiers wearing the counterfeit shoulder patches of the 30th Infantry Division drifted into the local taverns and cafes of the surrounding towns. They were actors, playing the role of exhausted infantrymen on a brief reprieve. They leaned over bars, their voices hushed but carrying just enough for a suspicious ear to catch mentions of river crossings and bridgehead coordinates. In one daring move, a convoy of 3 jeeps bearing the markings of the 6th Armored Division screeched to a halt outside a tavern known to be a haunt for Nazi collaborators. The men spoke loudly of a demonstration crossing scheduled for the end of the month, their eyes scanning the room for the subtle shift in a stranger's posture that signaled a secret being stolen. The tactical complexity of the operation was a frantic, moving puzzle. while the radio operators broadcasted a frantic web of false administrative traffic, carefully mimicking the unique fists or telegraphic styles of real divisional operators. The engineers worked to sell the visual lie to the Luftwaffe. They didn't make the camouflage perfect. That was the trap. They left just enough poorly hidden equipment under the trees for German aerial reconnaissance to spot. They strung laundry between inflatable trucks and lit small controlled fires to simulate cooking messes. To add a final layer of visceral truth, real bridge-building units were brought in, their heavy equipment clanking and clattering as they assembled actual sections of pontoon bridges along the riverbank, only to dismantle them and move them under the cover of night. The sensory overload was absolute. The air vibrated with the recorded screams of non-existent, non-commissioned officers, their voices amplified until they seemed to come from every direction at once.
"Put out that damn cigarette immediately!"
The smell of pyrotechnic canisters filled the air as crews ignited smoke pots to simulate the hazy atmosphere of a massing army. It was a masterpiece of kinetic theater, exhausting and terrifying. The men of the 23rd felt the crushing weight of their vulnerability. They were surrounded by the ghosts they had summoned, protected only by the thin rubber skins of their tanks and the hope that the German commanders on the far bank were seeing exactly what they were meant to see. High above, the faint, persistent drone of a German reconnaissance plane signaled that the bait had been taken. The ghosts froze, watching the pale moonlight glint off the wings of the intruder. Every man held his breath, praying the wind wouldn't catch the corner of an inflatable Sherman and reveal its unnatural lightness. The internal pressure was immense. The transition from a man of action to a man of trickery was a psychological strain that few had anticipated. They were spending as much energy pretending to fight as they would have in a real engagement, their nerves frayed by the constant expectation of a sudden, violent discovery. By the early hours of the morning, the sector east and west of Viersen had been transformed. Where there had been silence, there was now the bustling, noisy footprint of 2 full divisions. More than 600 inflatable vehicles stood in silent, rubbery formation, while 5 decoy L-5 liaison planes sat perched on makeshift runways. The radio waves were a storm of false orders, and the roads were choked with the phantom dust of non-existent convoys. The stage was set. The orchestra was at full volume, and the men of the Ghost Army retreated to their foxholes, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They had thrown the gauntlet down. Now they waited for the Wehrmacht to strike back at the shadows. The illusion was too perfect. On the 19th of March, 1943, the German response arrived not with a whisper of suspicion, but with the shriek of incoming steel. The Wehrmacht, fully convinced that 2 American divisions were massing in the Viersen sector, opened a heavy artillery barrage that tore through the morning mist. The first shells impacted with a bone-jarring thud, sending geysers of black mud into the air and showering the positions of the 23rd with razor-sharp shrapnel. This was the crisis the ghosts had feared, a frontal assault on a unit that possessed the footprint of an army, but the firepower of a single, lightly armed battalion. The situation spiraled into a surreal nightmare as the bombardment intensified. Unlike a standard infantry unit, the men of the 603rd could not simply hunker down in their foxholes and wait for the storm to pass. If their tanks were destroyed, the entire deception would vanish into thin air. A nearby explosion sent a jagged piece of casing through the flank of an inflatable M4 Sherman. The 93-pound rubber beast did not erupt in flames. Instead, it began to wheeze, its turret sagging pathetically as air hissed from the puncture. To a German observer on the far bank or a reconnaissance pilot overhead, a sagging tank was a dead giveaway of the American trickery.
"Patch kits! Get the goddamn patch kits!"
a sergeant screamed over the roar of the guns. Men who had once studied fine art in Philadelphia now crawled through the freezing slush, their fingers slick with rubber cement and grime. They worked with a desperate, frantic speed, slapping adhesive over the jagged tears while the ground shook beneath them. It was a macabre theater. Soldiers risking their lives to heal balloons under the fire of real 88mm cannons. Every time a shell landed close, the concussion threatened to topple the lightweight decoys, forcing the men to sprint into the open to tighten the tether lines that kept the fake armor from blowing away in the rising wind.
The psychological strain was reaching a breaking point.
For days, the unit lived under the constant threat of discovery. The air was filled with the smell of scorched earth and the pervasive, cloying scent of burning rubber as several decoys were finally struck and incinerated. The danger was not abstract. Though the unit's total casualties for the entire war would remain low, 3 killed and roughly 30 wounded, every man knew that a single determined German patrol crossing the river would find nothing but 1,000 artists and some loudspeakers to stop them. They were armed only with 50 caliber machine guns, weapons that were useless against the heavy armor the Germans were now rumored to be shifting toward their sector. The weather, too, turned against them. A sudden biting gale swept through the Rhine Valley, catching the broad sides of the inflatable trucks and liaison planes. One decoy L-5 plane was ripped from its moorings and tumbled across a field like a piece of tumbleweed, nearly exposing the forest to a lurking Luftwaffe scout. The men had to wrestle the bucking canvas back to the ground, their hands bleeding from rope burns, all while trying to maintain the outward appearance of a disciplined military encampment. In the command post, the tension was palpable as reports flooded in. Lieutenant Colonel Merrick H. Truly watched the maps with a grim intensity. Intelligence suggested an increase in Luftwaffe activity overhead. The Germans were not just shelling, they were watching. The question that haunted every officer was whether the deception was holding or if the Germans were merely playing along while they prepared a counterstroke that would annihilate the 23rd. "Is it enough?" a radio operator asked, his voice trembling as he tapped out another false report. "Is any of this enough to keep them from looking too closely?" As another volley of shells whistled overhead, the ghosts remained trapped in their own masterpiece. They were a symphony of shadows and echoes, standing defiant in a rain of real fire. They repaired their rubber titans and kept their speakers roaring, even as the earth churned around them. Each man felt the crushing weight of the thousands of lives that depended on their ability to keep this hollow army standing. They were the only thing standing between the Wehrmacht and the real Ninth Army. And as the sun began to set on the most dangerous day of the operation, the deception was quite literally hanging by a thread of vulcanized rubber. The tides of the Shadow War began to turn on the 21st of March, 1945. Brought not by a sudden charge of bayonets, but by the quiet arrival of a courier from military intelligence. The report he carried was the ultimate validation for the exhausted artists and technicians of the 23rd. German forces were pivoting. Captured maps and intercepted signals confirmed that the Wehrmacht was concentrating its dwindling reserves and heavy artillery directly across from the Viersen sector. The enemy's situation map showed the 79th Division exactly where the ghosts had placed it, while the real 30th Division had vanished from the German radar entirely. The bait had been swallowed whole, hook and sinker. With this confirmation, the chaotic desperation of the previous days crystallized into a cold, professional resolve. The mission was working, but the final, most delicate phase was just beginning. Operation Viersen was slated to continue until the 24th, and every hour of the remaining time was vital for the real Ninth Army to finalize its preparations 10 miles to the north. The men of the Ghost Army shifted from panicked repair to a rhythmic, controlled maintenance of the lie. The sonic trucks of the 31st, 32nd Signal Service Company increased their volume for 4 consecutive nights, mixing the sounds of frantic bridge building with the clatter of phantom treads to simulate a final, aggressive surge toward the riverbanks. A strange, expectant stillness began to descend upon the American lines, a silence after the storm that was more psychological than literal. The heavy German shelling, which had peaked during the crisis, began to grow more predictable as the enemy shifted from active counter-battery fire to defensive positioning. The men found moments to breathe between the roar of their own speakers. In the foxholes, the internal transformation was complete. The fear that had once paralyzed the young designers from New York was replaced by a grim, artistic pride. They were no longer just men with balloons. They were the guardians of a secret that was saving thousands of lives. The path forward was no longer a frantic retreat into the mud, but a steady, tactical performance. While the real 30th and 79th Divisions completed their secret training on the River Maas, the Ghosts maintained the illusion of a massive engineering park. Every inflatable tank that was patched, every radio message transmitted with the perfect fist of a real divisional operator, and every fake military policeman standing at a crossroads was a deliberate brushstroke in a masterpiece of deception. The atmosphere in the schoolhouse at Galeen transformed from one of high-stakes panic to the focused energy of a theatrical troupe on closing night. By the night of the 23rd, the tension reached a crystalline peak. The men knew the real attack was imminent. Intelligence reports confirmed that the Germans were bracing for a massive blow exactly where the 23rd stood, their forces divided and misaligned. Colonel Harry L. Reeder observed his men, the fashion designers, the bird illustrators, and the architects, working with a precision that rivaled any combat unit in the ETO. They had held the line with nothing but air and echoes. As the first hints of dawn began to gray the eastern sky on the 24th, the men of the Ghost Army felt the heavy weight of the theater of war finally beginning to lift, replaced by a profound, silent anticipation for the thunder they knew was about to break elsewhere. At dawn on the 24th of March, 1945, the world did not end with the hiss of a punctured decoy, but with a distant, earth-shaking roar from the north. As the real Ninth Army under General William H. Simpson began its massive crossing of the Rhine in the 16th Corps sector, the soldiers of the 23rd stood in their muddy trenches near Viersen and listened. The horizon flashed with a rhythmic, artificial lightning that was not their own. Reports filtered through the radio nets, stripped of their deceptive layers. The assault had achieved total surprise. In the sector the Ghosts had so meticulously portrayed, the German defense was paralyzed, their guns pointed at rubber shadows while the real American divisions slipped across the river with only 31 to 36 casualties. The realization of their success brought no cheers, only a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. As the order finally came to stand down, the men moved like ghosts themselves, deflating the titans they had guarded with their lives. They watched as the M4 Shermans, which had weathered real artillery fire, shriveled into heaps of gray rubber and canvas. The air, once vibrating with the recorded screams of non-existent sergeants, grew heavy with a natural, heavy silence. For Bill Blass, Arthur Singer, and the hundreds of other artists in the ranks, the masks were finally coming off. They were no longer the 30th or the 79th. They were once again the 23rd, 1,000 men who had held back an army with nothing but intellect and artifice. The return to the United States in July 1945 was a quiet affair, devoid of the parades that greeted the combat divisions they had impersonated. Before they were deactivated in September, the men were given one final, absolute command: silence. They returned to their civilian lives, to the fashion houses of New York and the studios of Philadelphia, carrying the weight of thousands of lives they had saved, yet unable to tell even their families how they had spent the war. For over 50 years, their contribution remained a classified secret, a phantom chapter in the history of the Rhine crossing. It would not be until 1996 that the world would learn of the traveling show that won a war. Decades later, as a Congressional Gold Medal was finally struck in their honor, the legacy of the Ghost Army stood as a testament to the power of human creativity over raw destruction. They had proven that a lie, if told with enough courage and craftsmanship, could be a shield for the truth. As the last of the veterans looked back, they saw not just rubber tanks and loudspeakers, but the faces of the thousands of real soldiers who came home because a few artists dared to stand in the path of the storm with nothing but their wits. The ghosts had vanished into the history books, but the lives they preserved remained the ultimate masterpiece of the 23rd.